You're listening to 3 Days Through the Wood, a novel by Bear Mawasagi, as read by the author. Chapter 1. The Dark Forest. Leaves like dark storm clouds passed in heavy drifts over the woodland floor, winding around the stranger stumbling along the old and beaten path. The road twisted through tall shadows of trees whose grasping canopy obscured the midnight sky and left only slivers of moonlight to guide the way. "Where am I?" the stranger asked. The wood gave no answer. He buried his hands inside a rough but well-worn fleece that was so long on him it could have been a coat, and bundled himself tightly against the wind. His fingers slipped through holes worn at the end of threadbare sleeves. It felt comfortingly familiar. He could only assume it belonged to him. But that was the problem. The stranger couldn't remember anything about himself. How did he get here? He couldn't say. Where he even was here? He didn't know. Where he might have been going or coming from were questions entirely beyond his grasp. There was nothing for him to do but walk, and so he walked while wondering about the why of it all. No answer came to mind. Nor did he have any idea where the road might be leading him, but it was a road, and that meant it had to lead somewhere. The sounds of the midnight forest, screeching owls and creeping things passing through dark branches, all offered answers of their own to his questions, but the stranger had neither the speech nor wisdom to hear them. Sparrow and raven, pigeon and hawk, all shouted answers that he simply couldn't understand, even though he recognized their names by their cries. It was strange, he thought, how, despite his missing memory, he could remember all the names of all the creatures in the wood. All things had to have a name, he knew, and he started to wonder what his might be. He wondered how he had lost it, and how he might be able to find it again. Then he wondered if his name had ever been important enough to remember in the first place. The sparse light of the moon was pale, and in the woods beyond its fragile grasp, the trees grew down like branches from the midnight sky. The stranger's eyes were too narrow to pierce beyond that vast and endless black. There was a deep chill to the air, and a cold wind chasing it further up the road. Or down? The stranger wasn't sure which way he was actually walking, and there was no sun to gauge his direction. Nor could the stars be seen in the few fragments of sky visible between the trees, shrouded by heavy clouds. A storm was rising, he knew, but he couldn't say just when it might fall. "Hello?" he called out hopefully. The wood gave no answer. What detritus the wind left in place the stranger forded, wading through deep drifts of crisp autumn leaves that crunched underfoot. "When you're lost in the woods, you're supposed to stay in one place, right?" he asked aloud to no one in particular. Words helped break the eerie quiet lingering between the trees, even if it did little to dissuade his unease. An idea was growing in his mind that something was watching him, following him even. He feared to catch it in the eye and prompt it to action, but knew he couldn't simply leave himself exposed either, and so swiveled his head in swift and frequent glances. He found nothing but the dark corners of his imagination waiting for him, turning shadows into faces lurking between the foliage. Even when he couldn't find anything else, he convinced himself it was because whatever was stalking him was too fast to be seen, dancing just beyond the edge of his sight. "Maybe I should just wait for someone to find me," he said aloud, as if to reason the spirits of the old road into acquiescence. "I'm not hungry, so I probably haven't been out here too long, and I don't think—" Of course, why hadn't he thought of it sooner? The first and most obvious thing he should have done was check himself for injuries, and the first and foremost place he should have checked was his head. He found patches of rough and unevenly cut hair, spurting in ragged tufts along his scalp. Much of it stuck to his hand when he pulled away, and he had to wipe it off on his fleece. Otherwise, there were no wet patches or dried stickiness that might imply he had suffered a cut to the head, nor were there any lumps, bumps, or goose eggs forming like the sort one might find had they, say, tried to headbutt a tree and then lost. He ruled out a potential head injury. Further inspection found no sign of injury elsewhere either, at least none that were obvious. His wrist was sore, but that might have been because it was so very thin. He could wrap his hand clear around it near to the forearm. That same scrawniness continued all the way up to his elbow, then to his shoulder, and finally all the way down to his chest and to his waist, where prominent hip bones pressed tight through his skin. He wasn't quite so thin as to seem starving, but he was definitely verging on sickly. Maybe he was the sort to consider food less as a thing to be enjoyed and more as an unpleasantly necessary sort of chore, sampled only begrudgingly. "If this is a joke, just tell me right now," he said to the wood. Pleaded, really. "I won't be mad, I just want to know." The wood gave no answer. The old dirt road wound through the ancient forest for a long while. The stranger thought maybe he could find footprints somewhere along the path to follow, indications that anyone besides himself might have come through recently, but he seemed to be alone. There were no tire tracks, bicycle marks, paw prints, or even litter along the way. There was no sign that anyone had ever wandered through this section of the forest at all, save for the fact that there was a road. If there were a road, then surely someone had put it there for a reason. It was near an hour before he had the thought to look for his own footprints, to maybe try following them back the way he'd come. By then, it all seemed too far back to bother, and the idea didn't appeal to him anyway. Besides that, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was still following him, waiting ominously for him to see it properly. He quickened his pace instead. Somewhere through the forest, sometime into the long while he spent following the path, the sound of water started to stream through the leaves as if from a river or brook. He knew that water often meant people, although he couldn't remember exactly how he knew that. Even if there were no people along the water, he could surely follow it somewhere, but that was silly. He was already following a road. Still, even if there was no one to be found by the water, he could at least give himself a quick rinse. He was starting to sweat through his fleece despite the cold. A wash sounded very appealing. Walking carefully over moon-black brambles off the path and deeper into the shadowed wood, the stranger ventured forth. Forest thorns tried to bite through his thick pants as he stumbled blindly through the dark, guided only by fleeting glints of moonlight falling in shafts through the trees and giving glimpse to the great glowing eye following in the sky above. Branches scraped over his skin like long fingers, grabbing at him, trying to hold him in place, to keep him from traveling any further. When they curled into the hem of his hood and snagged, the stranger bolted, tearing free and shielding his face in his hands as he dashed madly to the source of the water's call. Roots reached out to snare him, and one managed to catch around his foot, sending him sprawling to the dirt and crashing through a thicket of pointed brush before rolling to an unsteady stop. He was in a clearing of trees now, which were pulled back just enough for the moon to watch over the glade in full. His face had stopped a hand's breadth from a wide pool of boiling water. "I hope you weren't stopping for a drink," said a quiet voice. The stranger swung his head about, absurdly certain for a moment that the forest itself had spoken to him. Mist was pooling along the ground like low-flying clouds, shrouding the forest in white, and he raised his eyes higher. The girl who spoke looked half a giant from his place in the dirt, perched lightly atop nearby rocks as she lowered her feet into the hot springs, but she was probably only as tall as the stranger in truth. It was tough to make out her face in the dark, a task made tougher still by the shadow of her straw hat eclipsing over the moon. Long hair billowed from beneath it into the wind. Despite their distance, the stranger could see the girl's hair was tangled and knotted. "You know this place?" asked the straw hat girl. "Not well," said the stranger, glancing uneasily to the trees. "I don't think so, anyway. I could actually use some directions if you don't mind. I think I made a wrong turn." "No turns on this road," said the straw hat girl. It was hard to read her shadowed face, but the stranger thought she turned to look his way. And no point trying to go back. Okay," said the stranger, feeling a little uneasy now. The straw hat girl was watching him impassively. He didn't know how well he knew her, if at all, but he thought her voice sounded strangely sad. A cautious and guarded part of himself warned against saying anything too personal, and that meant not saying anything at all about his memory loss. That somehow seemed a very, very bad idea to him. "I wasn't going back that way anyway," he said, gesturing vaguely to the road. The straw hat girl nodded somberly. "I was just wondering what's down the other way. I've never been." He didn't think that was a lie. The straw hat girl lowered into the hot spring like a shadow dripping slowly down a wall, stopping just as her head threatened to vanish beneath the bubbling surface. The pool beneath her was almost glowing in the moonlight, highlighting her lips into a sorrowful smile. "Me neither," she said before vanishing. Only her hat was left to float along the surface of the water. The stranger watched, waiting for her to surface again, and started to count the seconds. When the seconds turned to minutes, he started to wonder if he was counting too quickly. What if the minutes turned to hours? Should he do something? He felt rooted to the spot, invested in the survival of the girl somehow, and was unable to move even as the feeling of dread grew. A sharp and sudden gust of wind caught the straw hat still floating on the water and carried it to another pool nearby, where it floated again gently over the surface. Something began to spread from beneath it. A darkness coated the water. The straw hat girl resurfaced beneath her hat. "What are you still doing here?" she demanded, bobbing along the water nearer to the stranger. Her face was still hidden in shadow, ringed by the light of the moon, but her eyes glinted narrowly through the dark of her tangled hair. Closer, closer she started to float, parting through the warm mists and watching with a queerly familiar look, a familiar anger that the stranger couldn't help but shy from. "Well, thank you for your time," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He turned his eyes to the ground. Water splashed, and then the girl was standing, rising from the spring. When the water dripped down her arm, it dripped in red. "I won't bother you any longer," he said. I'll just be on my way." A bloody hand gripped the rocks as the straw hat girl pulled herself over the edge. She looked frail as a branch, her fingers like budding roots gripping over the edge of the rock. Her eyes were fixated on him, and his were fixed on the blood. The forest brush reached out to root him again as he stumbled backward, but the stranger caught himself enough to keep from falling. The straw hat girl was out of the water, walking slowly toward him, growing closer. Now he could see her eyes getting wider, a storm of sadness and fury. She was insane, he thought, dangerous, broken, and he needed to get as far away from her as he could. A particularly handsy root grabbed the stranger's leg and dug itself into the fabric of his pants, pulling him down into the dirt as the straw hat girl advanced. She was right behind him, moving through the brush and bramble as easily as if it were a road, her eyes still gleaming in the moonlight. The stranger turned and ran, holding his hands up as he readied to defend himself. The sounds of the forest grew still suddenly, then echoed into a long and eerie silence. After a moment's panic and a moment's fear, the stranger turned to look behind him. The straw hat girl was gone. He could hear no water bubbling in the distance. There was no mist running over the grounds from where the hot springs burned. Somewhere through the deep dark of the forest he could hear an owl hooting, unconcerned with the meager worries of folk like him, and then the sounds of the forest all slowly returned. The stranger dusted off the leaves and twigs that clung to him, wondering what had just happened. Was this a dream? He didn't think so, but he pinched himself on the arm for good measure. It only felt numb. Everything else around him felt all too real. Maybe, he thought, before losing his memories, he had stumbled upon a mushroom that he really shouldn't have eaten. There was nowhere for him to go save to follow the path. The stranger looked to the dirt, found his footprints, and followed them back to the road, his pace quickening when he imagined the straw hat girl walking behind him. Her form twisted and grew every time he reimagined her. He didn't know how she had moved through the pools so strangely, or what exactly she wanted from him. All he knew was that he wanted to leave her behind, to put as much distance as he could between her and himself. He walked until he could feel weariness starting to claim his body, slowly spreading through his limbs like sap down a tree until his footsteps became sluggish and uneven. He walked for what might have been hours, putting as great a distance as he could between himself and the specter of the hot spring glade. He tried again to remember how he had gotten here. Trying to see through his memories was like trying to peer to the bottom of a vast, dark lake at midnight. There were only ripples and reflections off the surface, fleeting and insubstantial. His past was out of reach, at least for the moment. The stranger walked until his legs almost collapsed beneath him. He didn't feel hunger gnawing at his stomach yet, or feel his lips cracking from thirst, so he reasoned he could lay down safely to try and sleep. While the night was cold, it wasn't so cold that he would risk freezing unless the weather suddenly turned. Digging himself deep into the base of a vast tree just off the road and hiding himself in some bushes, the stranger curled tight into a ball, retreating into the wide warmth of his fleece and pressing it tightly to his face. There he tried to get some sleep, and wondered what more the forest might show him on the morrow. That night, as the stranger slept in the wood, he felt the eye of something even stranger still watching him.